Hello again and welcome to the Gospel of Luke. I can hardly believe we are already in our 20th session of 26 that we're going to offer for you to cover every chapter and verse of the Gospel of Luke. We're here again with our good friends who are scholars, Dr. Robert Maldonado, who is a philosophy prof and scriptural scholar at California State University, Fresno for the past 22 years, starting 23 this year at school. And Father Michael Lastiri, who is the Director of Worship for the Diocese of Fresno and Pastor of Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish in Hanford. They've been with us many years on many different programs, and we're so grateful for their expertise, and they're coming every week to share with us their love for the Gospels and breaking open the Word here at KNXT. I think Robert's going to pick us up where we are at chapter 19. We are in the Holy City. And Robert, you want to contextualize this and begin with the text. It's yours to comment on.
Well, again, we're coming off of last week, and so the entry into the city on the colt and the Pharisees objecting to Jesus, and he saying that the stones would cry out, even if my followers were silent. And when he drew near and saw that the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that even today you knew the things that make for peace, but now they are hid from your eyes. For the day shall come upon you when your enemies will cast up a bank about you and surround you and hem you in on every side and dash you to the ground and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And he was teaching daily in the temple. And the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people sought to destroy him, but they did not find anything they could do, for all the people hung upon his words.
You've got people that don't really like him so much, and then there's these crowds that seem to be like, you can't touch him. What's Luke helping us appreciate at this point in the journey?
Well, I think it's clearly ramping up the tension, right? The sort of dramatic tension, and certainly if Jesus didn't have a popular following, then he wouldn't be annoying to the people in power, right? And so the fact that he actually seems to have a fairly not insignificant popular appreciation is part of the problem. But it's also, the lament over Jerusalem is obviously very poignant, but it's also, I think within Luke, it's related to the sort of the peace that is announced in the angelic Epiphany is sort of the kind of true peace that is the alternative to, again, the way the world does it, kind of thing. I should also, one other thing, I grew up thinking of the cleansing of the temple. It's very brief in Luke.
Yeah.
But it's, I tend not to call it the cleansing of the temple anymore, even though I just said it. I think of it as the temple disturbance. But even that's a little awkward, because I always thought of this as a kind of very dramatic, very noticeable act. And maybe it was, but if you actually see the reconstructions of the temple, it was absolutely huge. And so whatever Jesus did would probably not be noticed by 90% of the people that were at the temple. And I just point that out because I think it's so interesting how we grow up, if we grow up in the tradition, thinking a certain way about these things, and thinking of this as just something that like somebody goes into a church and does something up at the front during the mass or whatever. Well, that would certainly be noticeable, but this place is you should actually go Google or whatever and find a picture of the temple reconstruction with people next to it. You get to see the size of it, and whatever Jesus did would have been noticed where he was, but. And I find that just fascinating, because it's our imagination that constructs so much of our understanding of the text, and of course our imagination is not always connected with the reality.
It's kind of like, for me, when I first visited the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., this humongous church, And of course, you do the tour of the church, and then you go downstairs to this massive place with chapels and all that. In the corner, there's a bookstore, a gift shop, if you will. And I remember I was young at the time thinking, now I can imagine Jesus coming in here and says, here you are selling stuff in the house. And after having visited and been in Jerusalem a couple times and seen that, I says, if he cleared out the gift shop, people upstairs would have had no idea what was going on, other than the blare of sirens coming from police. And so I can well imagine it was a small incident. But even if you go to a large place today and you see, it can be. But it was significant. It was significant at the moment, and it doesn't take away from its message. And it doesn't take away from what he was trying to say. But it's easy to imagine, even in huge shrines today, and we won't talk about Lourdes and that kind of thing, because sometimes it can be a lot of things there.
But symbolically huge.
Symbolically
I was just
huge,
going to
yes.
wonder if the brevity doesn't deny the symbolic power of what that gesture was, even if 4 people saw it. He was making another statement, as we've seen him keep making statements with his action. That brings up, I think, Father Mike to walk us through the next passage, the question of authority.
Well, I'll read it. It says, one day as he was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priest and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, tell us by what authority you do these things, or who is it that gave you this authority? He answered them, I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? And they discussed it with one another, saying, now if we say from heaven, he will say, why do you not believe him? But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are convinced that John was a prophet. So they answered that they did not know whence it was. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Again, Jesus is in a very important place. He's in the temple. He's been teaching and preaching. It's interesting. It says he was preaching the gospel. I like that term when you consider the Gospels were not yet written, but he had already begun, and I think it's a part of the authority that he has begun to preach from what he has been putting together and what comes to him as what he's been given. But that whole idea of authority, we deal with that all the time. When you do something, if you don't have a badge on, people want to know what gives you the right to do this, what gives you the right to do that. And basically the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees are doing that. And as they do that, Jesus realizes they're not there as a friendly crowd. They're there to cause trouble. They're trying to trick him. He knows their game. He's been there before. And so he kind of throws the two. Is it from God or is it from men? Is it something that comes from on high? Is it something from within? And he knows that any answer they give is going to create a problem. But that's a part of the kingdom too. The whole idea of the kingdom is that it's not always neat. But he's not really worried about that. He's seeing these people that want to put him in a corner, and he's not going to be fit into a corner. Plus, he knows at the moment he's got all these other people around him. So it's always in the context of a larger community that is supporting him. And these people, the important people, the official people, come into it. And so therefore, he kind of puts them on edge and leaves it for them to answer where they're going to, and see where they go with it.
Now, immediately following this controversy over authority, the parable of the wicked tenants that Robert's going to crack open for us.
Okay, this is a difficult passage, so I'm going to read it as well. And like last week, where I brought in an apocryphal text, I have a different version of this one as well. And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long time. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants that they should give him some kind of fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant. Him also they beat and treated shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. It may be that they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, and the inheritance may be ours." And they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "God forbid." But he looked at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." Okay, so let me just read this is from the Gospel of Thomas, which is a fairly important collection of Jesus tradition that didn't make it into the New Testament, important to scholars of the Jesus tradition, because it's not as if it's simply more historical or anything like that. It's that it has a different transmission history, so that the Gospels were kept and then, of course, became more important in the church officially, and so that set a kind of trajectory of them being kept and mutual influence between them, whereas Thomas was a little over in this direction, and so it's not being reproduced in quite the same way, but it's still being reproduced, so it goes through a bunch of presumable changes as well. And so the parable in Thomas goes this way, and it's not introduced, it's simply Jesus gives the parable. There was a good man who owned a vineyard. He leased it to tenant farmers so that they might work it, and he might collect the produce from them. He sent his servants so that the tenants might give him the produce of the vineyard. They seized his servant and beat him, all but killing him. The servant went back and told his master. The master said, "Perhaps they did not recognize him." He sent another servant. The tenants beat this one as well. Then the owner sent his son and said, "Perhaps they will show respect to my son." Because the tenants knew that this was he who was their heir to the vineyard, they seized him and killed him. Let the one who has ears hear. Jesus said, "Show me the stone which the builders have rejected. That one is the cornerstone." And so just like in the gospel in Luke, the parable is juxtaposed with this stone that was rejected saying, but in the Gospel of Thomas, you may have noticed that it's much less annotated. Yeah. It's not, we'll get the inheritance. It's not my beloved son. And so Thomas seems to be preserving an earlier version of this story, one that's a little less theologically reflected upon as being about Jesus. And again, I can't help but, not to keep singing the same song here, but I can't help think that this one is a little closer to the preaching of Jesus, and that this story, even though it's very hard for us to hear it as not being a sort of allegory of Jesus' rejection, may have been yet another example of some kind of commentary on the sort of way that the people are being exploited by the system, the way, and I don't have a full story of that yet, but just I find Thomas's version really, in its less developed sense, quite interesting.
You know, last week with the Gospel of the Nazarenes, this week with the Gospel of Thomas, we're not meaning to confuse, we're trying to validate the possibility of alternative vision and also different insights on Scripture. So we hope you're enjoying something that I'm finding very exciting, to see what might be an early Christian text that's actually closer. If we're trying to be close to Jesus, this may be closer. On that note, we do have to take our little break, so stay tuned. In 1 minute, we'll be back to talk about tribute to Caesar, which obviously has something to do with taxes, which, like death, they're never going to go away.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at KNXT.TV to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello again. Welcome back. It's I guess the 20th episode. It's the second half, so we're closing in on Luke. Robert, you brought up that reading from Thomas. Is there a way you'd like to walk us through a little bit about the allegory or the fact that maybe we allegorize it more than we should?
Well, I think it's a really difficult problem, and I also just wanted to follow up. Part of my interest in sharing the Thomas episode or version is to let the viewers know about some of the things that Bible scholars do to try to understand the tradition, to see what we can make of it. And clearly, going back to the version that's in Luke, it's really difficult to be certain. But we can certainly try to figure out how it goes and what it signifies. If Jesus did speak it the way Luke has it, or close to the way Luke has it, then it seems to have some connection to the entry into Jerusalem, because it seems to be some kind of self-understanding of how he's going to be rejected or whatever. The real problem is with the kind of development, certainly of the triumph of the church and the persecution of Jews, this passage also simply perpetuates in the allegorizing of it, which would go, the allegorizing goes way beyond whatever I just said about Jesus's ostensible self-understanding of his messianic rejection or whatever, because it then lays the blame and sort of smugly accepts that we are now the new tenants. Woo-hoo, aren't we lucky or not lucky, or what grace or whatever it is, but still. So I think there's a real problem in general. The parables have a history within the gospel tradition and within the preaching tradition of being over-allegorized, even beyond. And one of my professors, John Donahue, said, that with parables, the thing is, the parables are the presuppositions of the kingdom, and he always said, it was so difficult to preach on the parables because he wanted to simply read it and sit down, because it's just the parable itself is the thing that you need to have your imagination just teasing over, and that the explanations, especially when they allegorize, tend to undo that process. And so I think the allegory is interesting, but it pushes, I think, in ways that the Jesus tradition didn't really seem to want to go, in my view.
Thank you for that, and to remind us that Luke is progressively leaning us towards anti-Semitic thinking, anti-Judaic acting. So in a sense, caution is a good principle to keep in mind. A little bit goes a long way. And on that note, Father Mike's going to bring up two last passages that we need to cover today. Father Mike, can you start with the question about tribute to Caesar? What's going on there?
Yes, Jim. Well, let me read it quickly. The scribes and the chief priests try to lay hands on him at a very hour, and they fear the people, for they perceived what he had told as a parable against them. So they watched him and sent spies, who pretended to be sincere, but they may take hold of what he said, as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. They asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and know no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness, and said to them, "Show me a coin. Whose likeness and inscription has it?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able, in the presence of the people, to catch him by what he said, but marveling at his answers, they were silent. And I think, again, the other world that Jesus lives in is the world with the political world. And how do you do with the political world? He's not there as a political advocate. He's not there to put his lifeline for political reason. And so whether or not to pay tribute, as we know that anybody who was ever, to be oppressed, they had to pay a tribute to Caesar that kept peace. Otherwise, the Romans would certainly come down. And so he says, you just do what you do, but don't mix it with what belongs to God. They're two different spheres. It's the kingdom. It's about the message of the other world. And having made this journey to Jerusalem, and then in Jerusalem, kind of, if you will, setting it up where the craftiness it doesn't get muddled in the message and the message of the kingdom. And so, they're trying every bit, especially those. And of course, they want to use whatever power. They don't have all the power to put him away, to stop his disruption. So they certainly are going to use a political end. And he just doesn't allow them to get away with them. They remain silent.
Anything on tribute to Caesar, Robert?
I actually see it as a little more oppositional. First, Jesus, the craftiness is really interesting, but if you're going to participate in this system that uses these coins, well, then you render to Caesar. But God and Mammon have no connection, which is on the money side, but the reign of God and the reign of Caesar have no connection with each other either in terms of likeness. And so render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's are if you participate in that. And I'm drawing a little bit more perhaps on Mark because the feature there is the hypocrisy of this. And so render to God the things that are God means be in the kingdom of God, the reign of God, as opposed to the reign of Caesar. So if you actually do that, you're not participating in that other sphere at all.
One final thought before we move on to this final thing on the question of the resurrection. I find it kind of cute that Jesus didn't have any money in his little pocket or whatever type of garment he had. He says, hey, you guys, show me a coin. I don't have any money, I'm broke. But that's just Jesus being broke.
Well, I think that actually relates to that point, is he's not participating in that system.
It is. There's not a single thing. We may laugh, we may smile, we may enjoy, but there's nothing that's in there that isn't purposeful, and there's nothing that's left out that isn't for some reason also. It could be just the evangelist's bias, but it's interesting what Robert's doing with Father Mike every week, helping us see the depth of a passage, which might mean showing a parallel that's a little different, or showing the nuance between Mark and Luke. It's very interesting to always see this. And Father Mike reminding us, how do you preach a text like this? These are the things we're trying to do with you week by week. Father Mike, one last chance would be question about resurrection. What do you have there for us?
Well, again, the Sadducees and the Pharisees come from different mindsets as far as the resurrection. In this particular section, it's where Moses talks about if a man's brother dies, leaving, and then down to the seventh. I always say in a homily that by number 7, he should have figured this out and run away as fast as he could, but he doesn't. He marries her, and it's humorous in a sense, because if you haven't learned, we can't discount actually a couple of things. We can't discount the number 7, the use of that, but the whole idea that what does resurrection mean? What does the other life mean? And so he's arguing the reality of resurrection. He's coming out of a particular background that there is life beyond. But what is acceptable in this life? What will be in the next? Holding on to what was traditionally thought and traditionally. That's why in the second paragraph, Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, But those who are accounted worthy to attain that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die any more, because they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Jacob and the God of Isaac. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all to live to him. And some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dare to ask him any question. Boom. But it is going back to the tradition that God lives, from the tradition of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham. I love there's a blessing, there's a beautiful blessing. I knew an Irish priest, he always did the blessing, may the God of Jacob, Isaac, and be with you. It's like bringing all of into the one single moment, that the resurrection is a one single moment, no time or space, but rather life in its fullness. And I think it's, again, a break for some, that whole new thing, and that is something that's a part of the kingdom where he is leading them to. And so he shares that with the other writers as well, that sense of resurrection. Otherwise, as Paul would say, it's all folly if it isn't going to be a part of who and what we believe.
Got about a minute, Robert. Any final thought?
Well, just one last thought is again, it's kind of an historical thing, but the idea of the resurrection was relatively new in the time of Jesus, which is hard, I think, for most of us to actually wrap our heads around, because so that the conservative position was, you don't believe in that. And so I just think this is a sort of controversy. Jesus clearly was in the more liberal side on this new doctrine of resurrection, which had only been probably started somewhere in the 2nd century BCE, so maybe a century and a half from before the birth of Jesus, maybe a little bit more, not, no more than 200 years, which is not a lot of time. And so, but clearly, then the Old Testament gets read in that light, and it's now sort of taken more for granted as the norm.
In a sense, by us, yes, but by Judaism, not so sure. It's definitely a teaching that is not, it's as divisive, not divisive, but it is disputed as much in the Jewish community now as ever over the resurrection. We want to thank you for being here today. We hope you'll join us again next week. We still have 6 more episodes to share with you. We look forward to seeing you then. God bless.